Hey guys, Mr. Milton here. Today we're looking at choosing your method notes. At the end of this video, you should be able to choose an appropriate method to solve a given quadratic and explain why it's appropriate. Okay. Number two, you should be able to solve a quadratic using any method. Okay. Very important that we're explaining why. Sometimes we're asked for explanation like, hey, why did you choose this method? And people are like, oh, it's the easiest method. Okay, but why? Because it's the easiest. How? And usually that means, oh, it's the only one I know, okay? And we're trying to get past that, okay? So we have learned 5 methods in order to solve a quadratic. We've learned 5 methods to solve a quadratic. I'm hoping that you got most of those down, okay? We're gonna look at those 5 and talk about when it's most appropriate and least appropriate to use each method, okay? For most problems, there's more than one method that will work, okay? As long as your work matches the method you've chosen, you should be fine, okay? So the first method we talked about was solving by graphing. Okay, we talked about how to do this, find our axis of symmetry. From there, we'll find the vertex. We'll plot about 5 points on the graph. We'll see where our graph crosses the x-axis. The point where the graphs cross the x-axis is our solution, okay? But this method should only be used when I ask you to use it. It's a long process, and many times the solutions don't cross nice points. Okay, in the sense that when they do cross, there's select problems that give us really nice numbers, but even in those problems, it is the probably least efficient way to solve it. So unless you're asked to solve by graphing, probably don't want to solve by graphing. And in the real world, when you're doing these, you probably wouldn't want to do this unless you were trying to make a visual aid for what is happening in the situation. Okay, our second method that we learned for solving quadratics was solving by using square roots. Okay, and this method can only be used when b equals 0. Okay, if b equals 0, use it. It's probably going to be the fastest way to do it. Okay, it won't work if b doesn't equal 0. If there is a b value that you see, it won't work out. Okay, we attempted to remedy this with completing the square, our third method. Completing the square. And this method is best used when b is even and relatively large, okay? Also, we've only talked about how to do this when a is 1. So if a is not 1, we should not complete the square. There's going to be better methods for that, okay? Okay, we should not use this when b is odd or when a doesn't equal 1. Okay, if a is not 1, shouldn't use it. Not that it's impossible to do. It's just going to be way more time consuming. We'll have to discuss it a little bit more, which, with the options that we have, we'll just go to another option. Our fourth method for solving quadratics is factoring. This method should only be used when you are able to find the factors, I'll say relatively easily, okay? Okay, if you can find the factors relatively easily, then use it, okay? If you can't find the factors, choose a different method. Okay, if you're like, I cannot think of 2 numbers that multiply to give me 15 and add to give me 8. I can't think of it. Okay, then move on to the next thing. Okay, if you have those numbers, solve by factor. The last method is the quadratic formula. Okay, this method should be used whenever a doesn't equal 1. Okay, unless b equals 0, then we use square roots. And I say that because when a is not 1, we can't complete the square. Okay, factoring becomes a whole long process. Instead of just finding the factors, you're now going to have to find the factors and then either guess and check or put them in the box to find what our roots are. So we're going to avoid that and say if a is not 1 and there's a b value, let's just use quadratic formula. Okay, this method should also be used whenever the other methods don't work. Okay, the quadratic formula has to work. It either has to work or show that there's no solution, okay? So, like I said, there's never a time that this method can't be used. However, it is the most time consuming, or one of the most, time consuming, and has the biggest chance for mistakes or errors. Okay, so if you can find another method, probably going to be faster. Okay, but this one is going to be the, I'll say, trump card. Okay, that can't lose if you're doing it right. All right, so here we go. Backside of here, we are not solving these problems on these notes. If you'd like to go through and solve problems, you can ask me in class and I can walk you through how to solve these problems. But back to these notes, we're just looking at which method should we use to solve the problem. Okay, and then we're going to say why we should use it. Okay, so it says for the quadratic, pick which method you would choose to solve and explain why you chose that method. Okay, before we start, important, choose. Remember, of the first 5 methods, we said we really shouldn't ever choose graphing. Okay, it's the longest and the least accurate. Okay, so we will not choose graphing. Not that we shouldn't know how to graph and that all these methods are related, but we won't choose it. Okay, all right. So here we go. First problem, 5x squared minus 8x minus 12 equals 0. Okay, right away, we see that the a value is 5. It's not equal to 1. So we won't want to complete the square because a value is not equal to 1. I could look at factoring, maybe, because I'm kind of thinking like, oh, 60, I could do that. But a dot being 1, I'm going to say use the quadratic formula. Okay, again, the reason is that a doesn't equal 1. Other methods that you could use, factoring. Okay, if you're like, I can find 2 numbers that multiply to give me negative 60 and add to give me 8. Okay, then do that. But I'd probably use a quadratic formula here. Number 2, look at this problem. Take a second, look at it, see what you would have chose. Okay, I would have chosen factoring for this one. Why? Well, because I'm looking for 2 numbers that multiply to give me negative 14 and add to give me 5. I can think of those numbers really quick, 7 and negative 2. Okay, so if you can't think of those numbers really quickly, then you might have been like, yeah, b is not even, and there is a b value, so I have to use quadratic formula. So maybe you could have used quadratic formula as well here. I would have told you to stay away from completing the square because our b value is odd, and we'd have to work with a fraction for a long time. Okay, but yep. Number 3, 6x squared minus 24 equals 0. As you look at the formula there, or the equation there, you should notice, hey, there's no b value. Okay, and so since there's no b value, I'm probably going to say to solve by using square roots. Okay, the b is 0. Okay, you could also factor this one. Right, as I looked at this problem, I could say like, hey, I can factor 6 out. It gives me x squared minus 4. And that is a difference of square, x plus 2, x minus 2 equals 0. So you could, but notice that factoring isn't as simple as taking the square roots. Okay, so you could factor. You could use the quadratic formula. Okay, and one thing that you probably notice here is like, hey, if we don't choose the quadratic formula, it's always one of the other methods. Yep, quadratic formula solves all of them. Number 4, x squared minus 26x minus 407. I am not really excited to find 2 numbers that multiply to give me negative 407 and add to give me 26. Okay, so factoring is kind of out of the realm of possibilities for me here. But b value is even, and it's a pretty big number. I probably would go with completing the square. Okay, b value is even and large. Okay, so that's probably what I would choose. Okay. Other methods you could use, quadratic formula. could use the quadratic formula. Numbers are really big and a lot of negatives, so room for error. I would probably not choose to do that first, but you could. And if you were just like a math, like, hey, Mr. Milton, why can't you think of two numbers that multiply to give you 407 and add to give you 26? And factoring is there for you. Okay. So those are our three methods that we could have used to solve that equation. Number 5, x squared minus 6x minus 72 equals 0. Which method would you choose here? 72, I think I can get that 12 and 6. Yeah, that works out. Okay, so I would use factoring. A is 1. Factoring is just so much faster than quadratic formula. Okay. Why did I choose factoring? Because I was like, hey, what two numbers multiply to give me negative 7, 2, and add to give me negative 6 is negative 12 and 6. It works for both of those. Okay, I could fill that x in pretty quickly. Okay, other things that you could use, you could have used completing the square, because that b value is even. And so you're like, hey, I could do that, 3, put the 9 on both sides, 81, square root both sides. If you like that, you could do that. Okay, you could also use the quadratic formula because it works all the time. You could use it all the time. Okay, you cannot use square roots because our b value is negative 6, and if we have a b value, we can't do it. But yeah, everything else. Okay. Number 6. As we look at this, which method will we choose to solve this? Well, I'm looking and I see 3 numbers, but really, subtracting 1 from both sides, I notice here that there's no b value. I'd probably choose square roots. Okay. Other things you could use, I'd probably say quadratic formula, just because you can always use it. But I wouldn't really recommend very much of anything else. Well, maybe I could multiply by 3. I guess you could do factoring, but I wouldn't recommend it. Okay. Wouldn't recommend completing the square. Yeah, so really here, your square roots are quadratic formula. Okay, so really we talked about the methods that we know, right? Kind of said why we would stay away from graphing if given the choice, and the positives and negatives of the other methods to solve the quadratic. Okay, make sure you are able to solve using any of these methods, but also that you know when to choose any of the methods so that you can efficiently and accurately solve these problems. All right, that's the end of that chapter, guys. So putting it all together, and good luck on your tests. See ya. Okay. Other things you could use, I'd probably say quadratic formula, just because you can always use it. But I wouldn't really recommend very much of anything else. Well, maybe I could multiply by 3. I guess you could do factoring, but I wouldn't recommend it. Okay, wouldn't recommend completing the square. Yeah, so really here, your square roots are quadratic formula. Okay, so really we talked about the methods that we know, right? Kind of said why we would stay away from graphing if given the choice, and the positives and negatives of the other methods to solve the quadratic. Okay, make sure you are able to solve using any of these methods, but also that you know when to choose any of the methods so that you can efficiently and accurately solve these problems. All right, that's the end of that chapter, guys. So putting it all together, and good luck on your tests. See ya.